So welcome people from across Canada and the US as well. It looks like we've got lots of folks visiting us from south of the border. Welcome everybody to our ongoing series of Housing First Community of Practice calls and webinars. This one today specifically about getting back to housing, an important topic, an important concept, even in the midst of this unprecedented challenge that we're all dealing with at this point in time. It's great to have you all here. I wanted to introduce myself and my co-host. I'm Wally Check. I'm the director of the Canadian Alliance Training and Technical Assistance Program. And I have joining me Quinn C. Morkey, who is a fairly newly hired Housing First trainer for our organization. And we stole him from one of our presenters organizations today. So I hope that she doesn't sabotage this whole thing just because of that. But anyways, we're glad to have him aboard, and he's been doing a great job already. So just a brief note about the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. We are very multifaceted, and we have lots of things going. Many of you have been to the conference. Some of you communities are part of the Built for Zero Canada program. Some of the people from the US might be part of the Built for Zero campaign in the United States. Of course, there's a training and technical assistance program, and then we have our allied networks, which is a collection of different organizations or nonprofits or other groups related to specific areas that were pulled together as partners in working with us. So we are really excited to have all of them involved. Our mission at the Canadian Alliance is very simple but very powerful: to lead a national movement to end homelessness in Canada. And what better mission and goal could there be? I don't think there would be many. We also want to give a brief shout out to the Government of Canada, specifically the Capacity and Innovation Funding Stream of Reaching Home, who basically have made a lot of this work that we're doing possible. So we want to make sure that we acknowledge them because we greatly appreciate the efforts that they make in ensuring that we have the necessary funding to make these things happen. So briefly, Community of Practice Call is about giving information and then giving us time to talk about it, really. So we're really looking forward to the information that's going to be provided today, but we're also really looking forward to your thoughts and comments about the information that's been provided, questions that you have. We want to have discussion, so be prepared for that. And it's important that you know that the recording of this webinar and a PDF version of the slides will be available to folks on our website by the end of the day today. If not, on the very outside, it'll be tomorrow morning, but you can probably find it there at the end of the day. So if you know people who didn't get to see it, who'd like to see it and be part of it, or get that information, then it'll be available for you. So just a quick comment about your questions. Again, we really want you to be asking questions, and don't be afraid to post your questions during the presentation. We won't address them until the presenters are done, but please post them. And there is a Q&A function that you should see that will allow you to post questions. If for some reason you can't find it, then you can put them in the chat, but it would help to keep things a little bit better organized if you put your questions that you have or comments that you'd like to talk about in the Q&A function, and we'll be monitoring that. As I've indicated, also, we would really like you to speak and be part of this at the end. So when you make your question or comment, if you would just indicate at the end of that if you're able or willing to speak to the presenters or to whoever you want your question posed to. And then we'll unmute you, and then you'll need to unmute yourself, and then you can speak. So that being said, I'll get on with the agenda. So number one, we have essentially been in the process of that right now. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about some upcoming webinars and resources that we'll talk about again at the end, so I won't take up a lot of time with that. Give you a brief introduction to our presenters, and we'll let them take off for a half hour or so in sharing some really important information. And then we'll have our Q&A and discussion portion of the webinar. And then we'll close out.
Angela, Stella.
So just so you know, upcoming webinars we have coming on May 5th, one on outbreaks among people experiencing homelessness. Dr. Monty Gosh will be talking about that. Prevention and diversion during COVID-19 on May 7th. That'll be a webinar done by OrgCode Consulting. And then on the 11th, we have COVID-19 and homelessness, how frontline providers can support each other through grief while providing palliative approaches to care. Again, that's Inner City Health Associates from Toronto. And the Peach program there will be giving us information on that. Again, this slide will be available later and will be available in the recording and the slides that you can access later on today. Also, we wanted to make mention that we have a resource coming out that's been put together by members of our fantastic team here at Canadian Alliance. Getting back to housing, a guideline for a housing-based response during COVID-19. Shout out to Amanda DeFalco Quinn, who's on the line with us, as well as Amanda, Carrie Kitely, who's also listening in, Lisa Bell, and Michelle Bess, all from the Canadian Alliance. So we're really excited for that resource to come out. And that will be available on Monday during our regular COVID-19. Well, it'll be available through, the CNH3 website on Monday. And a link will be provided to access that. All right, actually, before I go to that first slide, I just want to introduce our presenters for today. Give a brief explanation about who they are. First of all, we have Emily Dietrich. You can wave to everybody if you want, Emily. And Emily is a facilitator, leader, educator, and change maker with 15 years of experience building capacity for healthy and strong communities. Emily has studied arts and education in her undergraduate degree and has an MBA in sustainability. She spent over a decade working in remote Indigenous communities. She joined Homeward Trust in February of 2019, and her department includes all Housing First programs, including coordinated access, youth programs, clinical and high intensity programs, landlord relations, and permanent supportive housing. And so we're really excited to be able to have her with us today. So welcome, Emily. And we also have joining Emily, and they've done some work together to collaborate on this presentation, Michael Shore. Michael is joining us from south of the border. He is president and CEO of Home Incorporated, a leader in permanent housing solutions for individuals and families experiencing homelessness. Home Inc. Partners with nonprofit and public agencies to operate permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing programs to stably house over 3,500 formerly homeless households throughout Maricopa County. Michael also works closely with public housing authorities in Maricopa to increase access to mainstream housing programs for homeless and vulnerable households. Michael served as the director of operations for the 100,000 Homes campaign, which is actually what then turned into Built for Zero, which was also the equivalent of our Canadian 20,000 Homes campaign, a sector building movement that helped to transform the nation's response to chronic homelessness from 2012 to 14. And he continues his involvement in that on a national level as he does speaking, consulting engagements, in addition to serving as the chair of the board of directors for the Crisis Response Network. So welcome, Michael, and give us a wave. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to these great resources that we have here and let them take it away. So just let me know when you want the next slide up, and I'll move them on for you.
Wally, I did notice, I think we were going to have Emily go first, so you may need to advance to her set up slides.
Well, that's interesting.
You want, Mike?
That's interesting. Why did they,
see us up.
hold on a second here. My bad. Something happened here with our slides.
It wouldn't be a COVID Zoom call if it went flawless. So
That's right. That's right. Appreciate that that understanding.
I was thinking about all the things that could happen while I gave this webinar, and I actually don't have water in my condo this morning, and apparently I missed all the notices because I don't use the elevator. So my mother was going to show up here with water on her walker, and no doubt she would also probably want to measure me for the sweater she's sewing me. And then I was thinking my dog barking and my neighbors, and there's construction, so what can go wrong will go wrong. And I realized I have like scrawled horrible notes behind me. I just realized that. So we're all in the same boat. There we go.
perfect.
Give it a second here and it'll change to the
Yeah, we can just go.
presenter view. One second. Oh, everything just really slowed down.
I can actually start without the slides if that helps.
Yeah, go ahead and get started. I'll have this fixed here in just a second. There we
Okay,
go.
so it was actually, Mike and I had never met before we started collaborating on this webinar. So it's been really, really great to talk to someone from a different part of, well, a different country, and to see that we have very similar challenges. So what Mike and I decided to do is we're both going to take about 15 minutes and go through our slides, and then we have a bit of a joint slide around landlords at the end. And then we're hoping to leave quite a bit of time for discussion because we think that's probably where it's at. Knowing too that there's a lot of expertise on the phone call. And I mean, we're privileged to present, but we know a lot of you that are already doing this work, and we'll have lots to share as well. So early on, when I was still emotionally reeling from COVID-19 and how drastically our lives changed, I read a blog by the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. And this statement on the slide, "The pandemic changes our approach, not our mission," really stood out to me. That, you know, the essential work of of housing people is super important. And actually the public health emergency of COVID-19 really underscores why it's so important that people have housing and that they have a right to housing. And so really our work on housing people hasn't stopped since COVID has started. We've just simply changed our approach, and that hasn't been easy. And there's been a lot to that. And I think there's a lot more to come. So just a little bit about Homeward Trust in terms of the next slide there. And since you can't see it, I probably will talk to it more than I was planning to. But I'll just let you catch up here. Thanks. There we go. So essentially, you know, what the gist of the slide is really saying that we work with a lot of really great organizations and people in the city of Edmonton. Edmonton's a northern city in Alberta, Canada. And our greater metropolitan area is about 1.2 million. We know that by working with all these agencies that we partner with and fund to end homelessness, that it's really these collective efforts that help us to work during COVID. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what those collective efforts are. I'm just going to go to the next slide. Most of my presentation is going to focus on housing and how that work has continued, but I did want to mention the critical emergency responses that we've put in place as a result of COVID-19. So just a few things that I'm sure lots of people are doing, but we have an expanded day shelter program that screens everyone that comes there to see if they have symptoms. We've obviously, the government of Alberta has given funding to increase shelter capacity so that there can be more space between mats. We've also opened up with our partners an isolation sick shelter. So it's a 24/7 medical supports for people that have COVID symptoms or have been have tested positive, and they can receive medical supports. And then finally, just last week, we opened what we're calling a bridge housing program at the Coliseum Inn, or a hotel. And a bridge housing program simply is a limited stay accommodation, so 21 to 60 days, so that it's just a jumping off point or a bridge to permanent housing. So those are some of the critical emergency response things that have been put in place with our partners. If we go to the next slide, I just really want to talk a little bit about our overall strategy, and then I'll go into some specifics. In short, our strategy can be summed up as we really need to house as many people as possible, obviously. And then all the folks that we have are supporting from a case management perspective that are in housing or in our permanent supportive housing sites. We also need to help them maintain their housing. So that doesn't really sound a lot different than what we did before. However, I do think there's a greater urgency, obviously. And what we've also noticed is there's greater urgency on the behalf of the people that we're working with too. So specifically, recognizing that the impacts of COVID-19 are going to increase the inflow to homelessness. And so we're working at, and we've expanded some of our lighter touch programming, such as diversion and supported referral, which is programs that are not for people that are chronically homeless, like people that have been homeless for a long time, but they're really programs for people that are about to become homeless or they need relatively little support to resolve their homelessness. We've also taken a look at our bindings list, and we've actually prioritized populations on there for people to house, and we're prioritizing people with complex health problems that would likely lead to complications and families. We continue the important work of recognizing that long-established Indigenous culture and spiritual practices and traditions really need to be integrated into our service delivery and how we work with people. And so that continues to be something that's very important, and we'll talk a little bit about today. Finally, related to people that are already housed, they need some supports to stay housed, and they have unique challenges because of COVID-19. And of course, with all the attention on congregate settings and the fact that we both operate congregate settings and then we work with our partners to run congregate settings such as permanent supportive housing sites or group homes, how can we prevent the spread and prevent an outbreak in those sites? So if we look at the next slide, just some high-level results today. If someone can add 126 plus 73, that's how many people have been housed since COVID has started. At the expo site, we have people dropping in at the expo site of about 700 people a day, and at 400 people at max at a time because we have them all socially distanced. So out of those 700 people that drop in and out, we've engaged almost 350 in a housing conversation. We definitely want to do more though. Next slide. Oh. So just talking a little bit about cultural support. This has actually been, sorry, it's okay. This has been super challenging in terms of our team offers a number of experiential learning opportunities for the teams that we work with across the city. And these include attending ceremony, Indigenous circles, pecking berries, all sorts of things happen. And of course, we can't do those right now. So we are offering staff support circles and experiential learning circles that are offered online. And so while this is challenging, this work is still continuing. If we look at kind of the approach with supporting housing teams, I was looking at this slide, which is the next slide, and I was like, wow, we sound so organized. But I have to tell you, the first couple days of COVID, a lot of our attention was placed on, putting together those critical emergency response, like opening the expo, opening the isolation shelter. It took a lot of thought and resources. And I feel like for 24 to 48 hours, I kind of forgot what my job was. And my job is to make sure that all of our programming can continue. So had a bit of an aha moment. I'm like, okay, there's so many people that we work with across the community that we need to support. And I think we almost need to be supporting them, if not daily, but weekly. And so we divided all the programs that we work with partners across the city into 3 working groups, and you'll see them there. So one focuses on the actual housing activities where we're actually helping people get housed and all those people that do that. The second group is focusing on people that are already housed and all the workers that support them from a case management perspective, and then finally congregate settings. So we really had to change our approach with working, because sometimes we take a lot of time and we try to be thoughtful about things, and we're still trying to be thoughtful, don't get me wrong, but we're also trying to be responsive and nimble. And so keeping it action focused with these groups is, we ask the questions all the time to the teams on the working groups, like, what do you need right now to do your job? What's holding you back? What can we help with? And then, you know, what do we need tomorrow and what do we need early next week? So really focusing on that. So as a result of those working groups, if we advance to the next slide, for the housing working group, which is really focusing on our workers that are actually coordinating, helping people find housing, view vacancies, move in, those kinds of activities, we've obviously developed a number of adapted practices and shared those. We've built on the tip sheets from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness and put a place-based focus on them. We've implemented a new policy as it relates to getting consent to work with people remotely. There's a bunch of work related to connecting with landlords and coordinating vacancy, and also coordinating the screening requirements that landlords are using and how they've maybe changed in the context of COVID. We continue to reinforce that we don't want to saturate certain areas or buildings, and so we have a building saturation tool. Something I'm really excited about is the third bullet from the bottom, is Alberta Supports is the Government of Alberta department here that administers income support for people that need help. And so a lot of our clients are trying to access Alberta Supports, but when COVID hit, if they called the 1-800 number, or if our workers called the 1-800 number, we wouldn't get a phone call back for 2 weeks, which is a long time. And it's a real barrier to housing, because obviously you need income to have housing. So Alberta Supports was able to set up a virtual team, and that virtual team provides support to housing workers. We started with at the Expo, and now we're rolling it out across the city. So I'm really excited about that. And then this last one, I know it's just a bullet, but this is challenging, this how do you work safely, because there's so many different sources of information, and a lot of the sources of information are built for healthcare settings or shelter settings. And so we kind of dissected all the activities, and we ended up making a simplified spreadsheet, and then we were able to work with our public health authority to have that validated. Let's go to the next slide, please. So with the second working group, this is about supporting the approximately 1,500 people that we have on caseload who are adequately housed right now. So obviously we've given them care packages and brought those out. We've also worked with our data team to identify people that have had what the data team calls red flag efforts in the last year. And those efforts are related to maybe eviction or EPS involvement, police service. And so we recognize that those clients may have a higher risk of housing instability, especially with the pressures of COVID. And so we've rallied around them to put in extra supports. And that means increasing remote supports, like talking to them on the phone, tablets. We've got some donations for those kind of things. We're funding those throughout the city. But it also means face-to-face contact as well. So if we go to the next slide, you know, sitting in my chair in my living room and the start of COVID-19, because that's how unglamorous it is, right? It's midnight and you're trying to figure out what's going on. You know, the congregate settings that we fund and then we also operate were causing me just some real anxiety, to be frank. Imagine having an outbreak in one of these facilities. Do we have enough staff? How do we support the staff that are there? So lots to work through with this group, and I'm feeling like we're in a better place now. There's been some really good work on the part of the group, but one of the first things that came up is our legal right to limit visitors. And this would be our legal right under the Residential Tenancy Act and also the Supportive Living Licensing Act in the context of the public health orders. So we were able to work through legal counsel, and we did that very quickly. Actually, it sounds really official. I called a friend of mine who's a lawyer, and she wrote a briefing in a night. and then we were able to implement some actions related to that to actually restrict visitors. Staff mental health during the pandemic is an ongoing conversation and providing resources. And I guess the biggest thing that we've focused on is business continuity planning. And so this idea that most facilities would have a business continuity plan, which would help manage labor disruption and supply chain disruption. However, no one's business continuity plan would plan for the scale of disruption of COVID-19. And so we've been working with to ensure that there's proper pay considerations for the people that work at sites. And that's something we're just rolling out shortly. Also supplying additional resources so that we can hire extra people to mitigate labor disruption. That's been super important. I'll just bounce to the next slide. So obviously engaging participants is critical in the housing process. And I think there's some upswings with the virtual. I think the week after COVID happened, our youth housing team housed more than they had housed the month before. And I thought, and that was super interesting. Like, you know, there's greater urgency to get housed, but there's also some efficiencies that come from a more virtual environment. So that's what this slide outlines. We've had less no-show viewings. We've been able to cluster viewings in a certain area, and that way the person can take a bus to that area and see a few at a time. And the social media platforms have been really good and helpful. And I'm just going to share a success story and then turn it over to Mike. This is Jess. They is one of our housing outreach workers. And I just want to share this little bit of a story. He was working at housing 2 male youths together as roommates, which is super challenging. These 2 young men were actually accessing the youth shelter system. So they actually gave a virtual tour. And the way they did the virtual tour is they met with the landlord in advance and did a tour with a phone. And then they were able to send that to the people that wanted to live there. They took a look at it. They ended up arranging a meeting between the landlord and kept social distancing in place. The application was submitted, everything was done virtually. And then move-in day, there was a bit of challenges because it seemed like a lot of people from our Find, which is our social enterprise that drops off furniture. So they actually had people go into a room and they closed the door so they could remain socially distant. And Jess actually purchased groceries using a mask and gloves and then dropped it off for them. But now we're doing like pickup, so we don't have to actually go in. And then a welcome kit was dropped off to the unit. The really critical part of the housing outreach work is obviously what we call a warm transfer to the follow-up supportive work that occurs over the year. And so we were able to do that warm transfer actually quite successfully through a WhatsApp video call. So relatively simple tools, nothing too innovative, but we've had quite a few success stories like this. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Emily. So thank you for having me. I know it's interesting, I suppose, to have somebody from the States presenting to you all. It's an honor. I've been a bit of a distant fan to the Alliance for quite some time. I had a brief opportunity to work with Tim about a decade ago when we were doing the 100,000 Homes campaign and later the 20,000 Homes campaign. So I appreciate the work that you all are doing. When Amanda initially reached out to me, I wondered whether there were going to be enough similarities or if the differences between the programming would cause some confusion. Hope that it would translate. I think Emily and I, as she said earlier, learned quickly that there's so much in common in terms of getting people housed in the private rental market. So thanks for teeing that up, Emily. If you can go ahead and go to the next slide, I'll just give you a brief introduction to Home Inc. We're an interesting organization. We're a permanent housing provider in the Metro Phoenix area in Arizona. We only do scattered site rental assistance, meaning rental subsidy programs, voucher type programs. We do that at a pretty decent scale, about 3,000 permanent supportive housing vouchers that we operate, and about 400 rapid rehousing households are assisted monthly in those programs. We also contract with our local housing authority that here in the States, the housing authorities operate the Section 8 voucher program. And that's a mainstream, rental assistance program for low-income households. And in many communities, they are starting to prioritize and target that mainstream resource to families and individuals experiencing homelessness. And so where our housing authority has done that for veterans and other community members, they contracted with us to help them get leased up. So monthly, that requires that we have the ability and capacity to get about 150 households newly housed in the housing programs. Just one other quick note about us that's interesting is that we don't do any of the supportive services. So we are the rental assistance administrators, and we do the eligibility and a lot of the compliance pieces of housing that are real estate focused. We are a real estate entity at the end of the day. And so we're not social workers. It's a good leveraging of unique capabilities and specialties between us and our partners that makes that work pretty well. Just some local context. Phoenix is the 4th most populous city, or Maricopa County is the 4th most populous county nationally. Lots and lots of people are moving here. The growth has made it such that rents have been increasing rather dramatically, more like 8% annually. And the vacancy, even though 2019 is not shown here, did dip below 4%. And really in the sub-market that we're working in, which is kind of B and C class type properties, the vacancy rate's closer to about 2.5%. And you can see the rents, those are the rent ceilings that we're dealing with. So trying to find units that are affordable and amenable to working with our housing programs is definitely challenging. If you go ahead and advance to the next slide there. So Amanda asked a great question when she was trying to do some framing for this presentation for me, and wondered whether being focused on housing was a skill set or a mindset. And admittedly, as I said earlier, because we are only a housing provider and we're not the full scale shop, this is our job, this is all we do. So it wasn't a big leap for us to get back to housing, so to speak. We didn't have to figure out how to decompress emergency shelters, how to get folks into hotel rooms, to really focus on isolation and hand washing station and all the things that our sector really jumped at and did in the first couple of weeks of the outbreak. That being said, it did require us to kind of have a reset of our mindset and really focus in on our role being very important. With our colleagues doing that very difficult work on the front lines, it's important for us to not hold up the process. We want to keep this train rolling of people getting out of those situations, shelter and streets, into permanent housing. And so we needed to focus less on our routine operations and more on new move-ins. So the next slide will kind of show you our results. So we've, in the last 60 days, housed upwards of 113 people that are brand new admissions into the housing programs across the permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing interventions. OPH is other permanent housing. So those are not necessarily supportive, but still subsidized housing programs that our families have moved into. And I list transfers on here intentionally. These are folks that are moving out of units in our housing program into another unit, and that could happen for any number of reasons. Our clients all sign 12-month leases, and so each month we have a large section, about 300 people whose leases are up and need to either be renewed or not. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of sales of multifamily apartment complexes in our community. A lot of institutional owners are purchasing these properties and then throwing a little bit of lipstick on there, jacking the rents up and opting out. Our community is fairly conservative and there's not as many protections for renters, including source of income discrimination ordinances or laws. So that simply means that landlords are free to opt out and decline to work with these programs. And so whether it's a new move-in or an existing client moving into a new unit, 273 move-ins into housing was an accomplishment, although that is probably only about 60 to 70% of our normal production. So I want to be authentic and say, like, we're not back to where we were. We're trying our best to surge and get there, but I'm still pleased with that work. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So I think it's just important for me to note really quick, and I like to kind of lean into this vulnerability as a leader to just let you all know that we were absolutely rocked by this thing. In the first 2 to 3 weeks, we didn't do much. We spent our time really recognizing, the psychological impact on all of us, myself included, of what it means to be an essential worker. I'll tell you that we had a fair amount of guilt associated with the fact that our doors are shut to the public and our customers, and we are relying on our supportive services partners and emergency shelter operators and outreach workers to continue to interface with our clients on the front line. And there's something to that, and it gets at you. But we needed to make sure that our staff was safe, that their family needs were being met, that they felt like their jobs were secure, and just really emphasize self-care. And so we decided to give everybody off Fridays to be with their families and just kind of recognize their humanity. We have been doing some remote work opportunities where it's possible, although our jobs are not really suited for that real well. But just the point that once we were able to kind of take care of each other, and we've been doing that with food and gift cards and notes and just everything we can do to really kind of shower people with appreciation and recognition right now. Once we were able to do that, we were able to take care of our folks. Okay, next slide. So a couple of things that were important for us, and this is going to be throughout. We quickly identified some of the stuff that is more compliance driven, routine operations. So much of what we do is about documenting people's eligibility, both initially and then annually, doing annual inspections. Unfortunately, we have to terminate folks in some cases, and we just stopped doing all of that. This was before HUD had actually given us some relief through the issuance of waivers for some of those activities. My mindset was just that I was willing to take a smack on the hand a year from now if a funder or a regulator came in and decided that we weren't timely in getting annual recertifications done. I was okay with that. I wanted to make sure our team was focused on everything that we could be doing to getting people moved in and transferred into new units. Next slide. So one of the things that we did in an adaptation, excuse me, to our process is we generally do orientations as a group in a large kind of classroom setting at our office, and then they meet with their housing specialists on a one-on-one basis following that for paperwork. That was of course out the door, so we had to transition to using various websites like this, Zoom and Microsoft Teams. We've even done some one-on-one briefings with an individual via FaceTime and their phone in the community. And on the paperwork and signatures, we've been fortunate to have our partners assist us in facilitating to get our paperwork signed and sent back to us in most cases. In some cases, though, that hasn't been possible, and so we're skipping it. I just want to say, like, we'll come back, we'll get signatures later, we'll get vitals later. Like, let's not worry about all of this compliance stuff right now. We need to get people housed, and so we've just really been leaning into the flexibility. Go ahead to the next slide. Another adaptation to our processes has been around landlord engagement. The great thing about having housing specialists and inspectors and housing location specialists at the office not being worried about annual recertifications and annual inspections is that everybody has been able to focus on outreaching landlords, recruiting landlords, and communicating with our landlords. So it's an all hands on deck moment. We do a monthly blog series that we send out via a newsletter to our landlords to let them know about various pieces of our programs. We made sure to remind them of our stability. The rental assistance payments are being increased. In fact, the deposits are available, incentives. Caria, who's on the phone here from Arizona's Department of Housing, has a risk mitigation fund that we were able to remind landlords of. And we didn't stop with our current landlords. We really went back and started to outreach the landlords who at one point had decided to discontinue working with us, perhaps because of the fantastic rental market. And lo and behold, our programs were looking very attractive. There's a lot of insecurity around rent payment right now from people who have lost employment, of course, and income, and our guaranteed rent payments are looking really, really good. I think I just have another slide, a couple here. Housing search, so adaptations there, similar to what Emily had already indicated, leaning into technology. So lots of property management offices we are finding are closed in the community. They're doing a lot of work via Windows and remotely, phone work, videos. There are some virtual tours available on various websites. We use a web-based housing search platform that we created about a year ago, where we've been able to really use pictures and the communication aspect of that platform with our landlords. The one comment I'll just make there is that for me, it's very important that our participants have choice in their housing and that they are able to, select the unit that they'd like to sign a lease for. And right now, because of this situation, I think we're doing a little bit more placement than I'd like. I don't like the term housing placement. So that's one thing I'd like to see us get back to normal on, is letting that participant select their unit in the community. I think one more. Yeah, inspections. So our inspectors are still doing inspections. We are required to do housing quality standards inspections for all of our various housing programs. And the inspectors are still conducting those live in the field. They're doing that as safely as they can with some personal protective equipment and social distancing. Property managers and maintenance folks are not accompanying them in the units right now. Lots of times we are being let into the unit with keys under the mat, lock boxes, etc. We have done a couple of video inspections with the landlord, just letting them walk through the unit and video showing us the various items. That's pretty rare. Most of the landlords are letting us in. But one thing we're doing is using photos to document corrections to deficiencies. And so if there's something that we can, have the landlord send us a photo of after they've repaired it, that makes that much easier. We don't have to go back out and re-inspect the unit. And again, we've been given the opportunity to temporarily suspend annual inspections for participants who are still housed. So I think my takeaway is just that there has been a great learning for us in that when you examine all of your operations and you look at what you do that is so compliance driven and so a lot of our paperwork, we've learned this is just nonsense. We need to pare this stuff down for when we get back to normal. It's just been amazing at what we can accomplish when we really focus all of our energy on getting people housed. So thank you.
All right, thanks a ton. Now there was this slide left. Is this something you guys want to speak to, or is just there for people's perusing?
Emily's muted.
You're muted, Emily.
There she is.
There we go. Hey, I pressed unmute, but it wouldn't let me unless the host let me. So thank you.
Okay.
So yeah, Mike and I wanted to talk about these things because I think these are common challenges and things that we discussed on the phone in preparing for this webinar. So some of the landlord engagement, I think for all of us, obviously communication is super important. And, my background is emergency management before I came to Homeward Trust for a brief period at the city. And they always do a post-mortem on what goes wrong during an emergency, and it's always communications related. And so really thinking about how to really communicate with our landlords, because in Edmonton, we house most people in market housing. It's not supportive housing. So this frequent communication that's saying that, we're open for business, we're housing people, we want to work with you, and your rental payments will continue. There's no break in funding has been super important. Also creating more direct, even access to myself related to challenges that happen. And normally I'm a little bit hands-off with landlord relations at times just because of time. But I've been actually trying to take more of an approach of actually reaching out to all the presidents of the companies and having phone conversations with them and establishing more relationships so that when there is something going on, we have a bit more to build on. But I think there's still more work to do in that space. One thing that I did want to mention, and I didn't put it in detail on the slide, but we did want to mention for us, one of the things that we've experienced here is that guest management, a term that's used to refer to people that are visiting participants unit, is becoming a concern, and a concern that has escalated to violence in more than one occasion in the last month. And so whereby a resident or property manager engages with either a tenant that's one of our participants and or their guests, and it leads to a very escalated conversation that results in some sort of bad altercation that has led to evictions. So it seems to me, I don't want to paint it all sunshine is what I'm trying to say. This is really hard. People are experiencing a lot of tension and anxiety. They're cut off from their social networks, they're scared, and then they have tense conversations with someone, and then it goes sideways. And so we're really trying to support landlords in that process. A couple times we've actually supported moving tenants out, putting them in a hotel, and then finding them housing just to alleviate the tension. I think that Mike has done obviously a great job talking about the virtual housing searches and doing things virtually. And what I really appreciated about Mike's comments, and even before we had this webinar, was just that we do all these things, but maybe there was an easier way to do them and we just weren't doing them. So I don't think there's business. I don't think we're going to go back to normal when this is done. I think this is going to really challenge us in how we work. And then the last point is, I was on these working group calls and I'm stressing to everyone, we really need to get people housed. And then I'm hearing feedback like, oh, well, what about this? What about this? And standards. And so there's the tension between getting people housed and knowing how to approach that with some nuance and principle based, but then also adhering to our program standards and adhering to building saturation. And those things are really, really important because it affects our long-term ability to do this work. Anything you want to add, Mike?
No, just a comment. I'll just say, because I think people are wondering this, we are seeing early signs in our rental market of some relief. It's been very, very tight on the vacancy side, and the rents have been extremely high. And I think the early signs of just the landlords calling us and indicating that they'd like to re-up and market their units to our participants shows me that there is an anticipation of a correction coming soon. The Arizona Multi-Housing Association, which is the apartment association, the membership group for the landlords and the community, has been reaching out to make sure that we have an opportunity to present to their members. So if there are similar types of associations, I think there are, finding that as a resource to do webinars for the associations, I think is a really good strategy to reach these landlords as well. So the time is now. I think we need to strike while the iron's hot. I mean, you don't want to, it's just, I know we've said this a lot, but the silver lining in this crisis is that I think we're going to have a lot more opportunity to expand housing opportunities for our participants in the coming months.
All right. Thank you both. Tremendously helpful information. I think very timely and, very applicable to things that people are facing everywhere. Really appreciate the time you've taken to share that with us and give us your insight and expertise. And I appreciated, those last comments, just again, hammering home, I guess, the idea that, and back to, I guess, an earlier point in Emily's slides, that housing is actually the best healthcare that we have for these folks. And that's one aspect of our work that should not be changing, should not be stopping at all. And in fact, this should give us an opportunity to show that maybe in situations where we didn't think that we could house as many people as we could, we actually probably can house more than we thought we could. And this will help us to figure out ways to do that. So hopefully it'll get some of our even internal naysayers to step it up and go, okay, you know what, I think we can do this. So thanks a ton. Quinn, what do we got going for questions and comments and people wanting to talk about things?
We have a couple. We have been kind of talking with people in the chat privately or openly, and then answering a few questions in the Q&A platform. But there are a couple of questions that we thought we could throw out to the panel. One of which I think is specifically for Emily. Now, she had partially answered this question, but it came up another time in the chat, and that's about the building saturation tool. Could you describe that in a little more detail? People are wondering how it works, what you mean by the building saturation tool, etc.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So it's not that sophisticated. It's just we have our homeless management information system, which is called ETO in Edmonton. And all of our teams enter the information about a participant in there, which includes where they're housed, so the address. And so then our brilliant data team did stuff on a map. And so we can view it on a Google map and see where the saturation is. And then we have just a really simple, accessible Google sheet that's accessible to all teams across the city that says an address and the rate of saturation. And so then when you house someone, one is supposed to look up on that. And if it's over 10%, you're not supposed to house someone there.
Great. We have another open question from Jim. When we reach a post-COVID-19 recovery period, do you expect all current government housing funding will remain? The Canada Housing Strategy, USA would be HUD. I guess the question being really is, there's a lot of new normals. What is your sense of what the future is going to hold, given that some of the opportunities that we're able to take advantage of right now are due to additional funding?
Yeah, I'll say from the United States perspective, we had Phoenix just release its plan on how to spend the CARES Act, which was our federal stimulus dollars that went to housing and homelessness. So we have about $27 million from HUD going to the city of Phoenix, and there will be other monies going to other localities in Maricopa County as well. They're just the first to come out with their plan. And we are going to provide a number of different services with that, including some shelter and hotels and stuff. But for rapid rehousing, there's going to be about 550 new households being able to be housed with those funds. That's temporary money, and I do not believe that that will be, refunded. So it's one-time shot in the arm. It's our opportunity to surge up. That said, I would just say our national advocates, specifically the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and then your guys' colleagues at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, are doing some incredible advocacy work with Congress right now, encouraging $100 billion in rental assistance to be allocated across the country to help people stay stably housed. So I do see there will be additional funds in the United States coming out of this, and we'll see what happens in November. I hope this has been like a successful audition for me to potentially come to Canada if November does not go well. But yeah, I see some new funds being available to us. So.
Okay.
Emily, did you have a similar thought on funds in Canada?
Yeah, so we're receiving funds from the federal Reaching Home dollars, and it's a very flexible funding package in terms of how we can spend it to meet the needs of community. And then we're also receiving funds from the government of Alberta, especially as it relates to our emergency critical responses. We also have the support of the city of Edmonton in many ways. So I don't believe there's necessarily commitments beyond the COVID funding, but we have funding from those bodies already for housing activity. And they've been very clear that it's a very emergent environment, and we'll see where this goes. So.
Great. We have another question is regarding the current situation and the little shot in the arm of funding that we have right now. Is there any appetite to use the circumstances to enhance the supply of community-owned buildings?
Go ahead, Emily.
I'm sorry, but what do we mean by community-owned buildings?
I'm not 100% sure, and maybe Stefan, if you want, we can add you to the chat and you can explain yourself. But in the meantime, I think what it means is that, for profit. So buildings that would be used to address homelessness, adding additional capacity to things like rent, affordable housing, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We're certainly actively looking at that. And there has been some provision with the federal government funding and requests for information about doing that.
And I suspect that will be a strategy in the United States as well. Back in 2008, when we had our first major crash, we had a lot of stimulus funding at that time. One was called the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, and that gave nonprofits the ability to purchase multifamily properties that had become foreclosed and that were owned by the banks. And that was one way our community added a number of units that were owned and operated by our sector for permanent supportive housing. And so I hope that that will emerge again.
I know other communities across Canada we've been in touch with are looking at creatively using the additional COVID funding for making capital purchases so that they can enhance the capacity within their communities. And I mean, some smaller communities that might be as much as they have a house, right? And that house plus a little work done to the house could suddenly increase capacity in a smaller, even rural community to act as a transitional shelter for multiple people, or act as some kind of a permanent supportive housing on an ongoing basis. So there are different moves that people are thinking creatively within various communities in Canada to do that as well.
So Quinn, Emily Dietrich had, or Emily, you had a question or you had made a comment. Is that something else that you wanted to talk about? I think I replied to you in the chat.
I think I was confused what you were asking. I think
Okay.
you were asking me if I would respond to the question, and I think I did respond to the question.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm not sure if it was someone else's question or not. I guess.
I did say that I wanted to respond with my voice, not chatting, on the question about bridge housing.
So, you had, yeah, so why don't we talk about that?
Okay, so I think the question was, could you mind just saying it out loud, Quinn, one more time?
Just a second. Somebody had moved it out of the open
I think it
question, so I have to find it.
Yeah, I think it was, what are the best practices related to bridge housing?
Bridge housing.
Yeah, best practices, where can we find information? So this is an interesting question for me, because as I indicated, I'm pretty new to the sector. And so I walked in and in my organization, they were talking about bridge housing. And I thought, oh, this is something I'm supposed to know about. I should be able to go get a bunch of journal articles and read about this. And what actually happened is I realized then that I was actually stepping into some sort of like a little bit of a politically charged subject, because there's like transitional housing, which is sometimes when people refer to transitional housing, they're referring to someone having to do things to qualify for housing, but not always. So it's a tricky expression. And then the way that bridge housing was being used in the community that I am in, is that it's meant to be a short, limited stay accommodation that's a bridge to permanent, safe, and suitable housing. And so the purpose of bridge housing in this context, which I was learning about, and then I had to articulate a program model, so I've learned tons about it now, is that it's that someone's sleeping unsheltered or doesn't want to access shelter. And so the idea is you give them a place to stay that's completely housing focused. So every interaction is about getting housing. And we did do a review of literature about this. The data team did that. And there wasn't tons on this, but one of the things that came out is A, it needs to be housing focused, but B, that the supports that are offered on site should be limited or in a way that encourages independence, because it's really about stabilizing and helping support someone so that they can actually be independent with a real recovery focused in mind. So we actually framed a bridge program model. We were about to do that, and then COVID hit, and now we've just done it in the context of COVID.
So Emily, part of the question as well was, where can somebody find information about that?
Well, that's what I'm saying. It was pretty limited when we looked. And so the data team
was... Can they get stuff from you?
Well, for sure. But yeah, absolutely. And the one thing that I'm doing is I'm trying not to use the expression bridge housing like with capital letters. I'm saying bridge housing, which is a 21 to 60 day limited stay accommodation that helps someone find permanent, safe, suitable housing. So it's more of a descriptor and less of a like rapid rehousing. It's not rapid rehousing, if that makes sense. Anyway, sorry, that was long-winded.
We are coming up on the end of our time, but we have a couple more questions that we can try to get through. We probably won't be able to answer everybody's questions, so let's try to get through some. There's one question that came up from the chat asking about the panelists to discuss, would adding peer mediators be a possibility to assist the relationship with landlords and tenants during these tense times?
I'll just say peer support specialists are a tremendous asset in our homeless services and mental health delivery systems, and they are, I think, the most successful case managers and support workers for our participants who are in housing because of their experience themselves with homelessness, perhaps mental illness, substance use, et cetera. So they're fantastic. I think that you know, we use them a lot now. If you're talking about a peer mediator, a different peer term in terms of how to negotiate an application for tenancy, or you know, how to interact with your landlord, that's an interesting idea. So my comments more about just the peer support specialist position, really, in the mental health and the support world.
Great. The next question is, as far as landlord and renter pairing, has anyone perfected ways of creating filtering processes or pre-approval for applications? Just thinking about the back and forth that happens in an apartment search application process. Are there concrete tips on doing this for with landlords knowing barriers they may be more flexible with, applicants still being required to apply property by property usually. This is a lot of lost time in the current climate.
Yeah, let me just say what I hope to do. We are hoping to develop what we would call alternative screening criteria that landlords may opt into in order to receive some specialized support, incentives, and protection in our housing programs. And that would require that they, and they do this largely in our housing programs. We've been doing this for 26 years and they know the game pretty well already, but it would require that they reduce some of their barriers in terms of criminal background's already been addressed in our country. It needs to be a case-by-case basis, no more blanket, bans on people who've been convicted of felonies, but specifically around evictions, credit, income, some of these types of things. So we intend to develop, like I said, a home preferred landlord certification that they could certify to those reduced screening criteria, and then implement that in our housing placement, or excuse me, our housing search platform, so that people can filter to the landlords that are accepting those lesser criteria and apply, and not waste their time and energy getting denied at properties that are screening people out. So it's not perfect yet, it's not even there yet, but we're working again with our apartment association so that landlords inform that conversation. It's not so much our idea that they're actually generating it themselves.
We probably only have time for one last question, and that is, do you see any positive outcomes from COVID-19 that could be used to coordinate into future planning as well as maintaining or increasing government support? I think, Mike, you had mentioned that there was a large rental subsidy work happening right now of something that could come in the future. Are we seeing something like that in Canada? Are there other aspects that could be positive outcomes? What are your thoughts, both of you?
Go ahead, Emily.
I think that it's hard to try to find a silver lining because COVID-19 has had devastating impacts for many people, both from a health perspective, but also from a family loss and economic perspective. However, it has underscored the need for housing and placed that conversation squarely on a really high-profile table. And sometimes one can capitalize on an emergency to help underscore what you've been trying to say from the sidelines for a long time. So that's just a thought.
Okay. Well, super. Any other sort of just last minute comments that either one of you would like to make before we close this out?
I'll just real quick, again, thank you. And then, but mostly just a big tip of the hat to the people that are doing this work on the front lines. I mean, I know that we are with you. We're, calculating rent and doing, payments to landlords. It's not quite the same. I do look at the people who are, working with people experiencing homelessness and getting them into housing every day as being our heroes. They inspire us, and they're the ones who are motivating us to, again, not let you guys down on our end of the bargain of getting the rent subsidies paid to the landlords. So thanks for all the work that the folks are doing across the country there.
Yeah, and from my end, just want to put a shout out to all the people we work with in Edmonton to do this work. This work wouldn't be possible. And I've been really getting to know the people from Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness in the last few months, but then because COVID started, just the support that you guys have offered has been really, really helpful. And I know it's cliche, we're all in this together, but that's kind of all we have right now. So,
Well, again, big thanks and shout out to both of you. Great information, and your expertise and insight is always welcome. And I'm sure that folks got a great deal out of that today. And just in terms of the frontline people, I also wanted to mention, remind people to take care of yourselves. Because, again, to use a bit of a cliche comparison or analogy, every time you're on an airplane, which none of us have been on for quite some time now, you hear that speech, right? To put your own oxygen mask on first. The powerful part of that is that's the reality of life, that if you're not well, you're no good to others. So if you really want to help the folks that you're serving, take care of yourself. And With that, I'll just remind you of, again, some of the upcoming webinars we've got. Please go to the cnh3.ca/resources website. There's lots of resources there, including multiple sort of one-pagers that we put together. I think Emily made reference to that earlier. And then be prepared for this this document that's coming out Monday. Otherwise, if you have any questions or comments, let us know. There's our contact information from the Training and Technical Assistance Program. And again, this recording will be available for people by the end of the day today. Yeah, go to our, it'll be available both on the CNH3 website as well as on our Training and Technical Assistance website. And the PDF slides will be available with that. And there's also a couple of documents that Emily and Mike, I think, provided for us that we'll make available with that too. So thanks again, everybody. Appreciate your time and attendance. Hope this was helpful, and have a great day and be careful out there.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, guys.